sales, quality products at affordable prices.
Good evening and welcome to Lead Story Prime. Tonight we're talking about oil, not in the abstract, not as a distant global commodity either, but as a force that shapes Jamaica's economy, our electric bills, our transport costs, and our vulnerability in a rapidly changing world. Jamaica imports almost all of its energy. That means decisions made far beyond our borders in Washington, Caracas, Ottawa, and Beijing do not stay there. They reach directly into Jamaican homes, businesses, and public finances. At the same time, the global consensus on climate action is fracturing. Major powers are doubling down on oil, retreating from multilateral climate commitments, and openly reshaping energy diplomacy as a tool of power. So tonight we ask, how does a small, oil-dependent state like Jamaica protect its economy, its climate future, and its sovereignty in this new energy order? This is Lead Story Prime. We have here in studios with us economist Keenan Faulkner, and online with us as well former professor of sustainable development at the University of the West Indies, Mona campus, Anthony Clayton. Gentlemen, thank you for being here with us tonight inside Lead Story.
Thanks for having me, Jody.
Let me start off with Keenan Faulkner here with me in studio. Keenan Faulkner, Jamaica imports almost all of its energy. From an economic standpoint, how exposed is the country right now to global oil price shocks?
Very exposed. I mean, it's historically been very high. It was at one point well over 90%. Now, I think we've reduced it to about 70%. So that dependence on fossil fuel-based sources of energy is clearly still more than we want it to be. The national energy policy, we want to get it down to 50% by 2030. And even though we're on the way, you know, we have had experience with biofuel, of course, wind and solar, but it's not happening as fast enough that we would like it. And just to illustrate what global commodity price shocks can do in terms of oil in the 70s, when we had those oil price shocks in 1973 thereabout, you're talking about the import bill tripled overnight. So just imagine what that would look like today, you know, just when the oil price shocks went up, price of oil went up, and, you know, we just could not get around that. As a small island developing state that we don't produce our own energy, those effects are magnified really. So there's no gainsaying what any oil shock or oil crisis worldwide would do to Jamaica.
Well, Professor Clayton, you're on with us as well. From your vantage point, oil prices, what do they mean to us as a small import-dependent nation, especially as we watch so much global consternation around oil and getting oil, going after countries with oil, and the concern about the impact that it could have on prices?
Good evening, Jadian. There's something which is really quite strange about the current market for oil, which is that we're already past the point at which renewable energy technologies are actually not only price competitive, they're substantially cheaper than the cheapest fossil fuel sources. And we actually went past this point a few years ago, but by 2024, some of the more competitive renewable energy technologies, notably solar photovoltaics, were coming in at about 40% cheaper than coal and oil and gas. Now that's a very substantial margin. And offshore wind projects are about 55% cheaper than fossil fuels. So what we're looking at really is not the lack of alternatives. There are alternatives and they're now actually cheaper. What we're really looking at is the lock-in effect and sunk costs in old technologies. So it's not really a problem that there isn't enough energy around. There is. The problem is that we've got a lot of infrastructure which is locked into dependence on fossil hydrocarbons. And it's making the transition out of that that's really going to be the challenge over the next few years.
A transition certainly that Jamaica has to be looking at as the world makes the shift as well. Let's listen into Amoy. She gives us an overview on the issue of oil here in Jamaica, the PetroCaribe agreement that allowed for us to obtain oil at lower prices and what it means for us in 2026.
Energy needs have long depended on oil, mostly imported crude. Historically, the island bought the bulk of its oil from Venezuela under the PetroCaribe agreement and supplemented from other suppliers on the open market. Now, Jamaica consumes roughly 70,000 barrels of oil per day, used for electricity generation, transportation, aviation, industrial fuel, among other things. Electricity production is the largest consumer, with diesel and heavy fuel oil powering most of the nation's power plants. For context, PetroCaribe was a regional energy alliance established on June 29, 2005. It was created to allow Caribbean and Central American countries to purchase oil from Venezuela under highly preferential payment terms. At its peak, the agreement included 18 member states, including Jamaica, Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and several Eastern Caribbean nations. PetroCaribe allowed Jamaica to buy oil at market prices but defer a large portion of the payment over 25 years, often at 1% interest. The initiative originated in Venezuela under the presidency of Hugo Chavez. It was a cornerstone of his Bolivarian foreign policy, which aimed to promote South-South cooperation and provide an alternative to US-led free trade models. By leveraging Venezuela's vast oil reserves, Chavez sought to build political and economic solidarity across the region. The deferred funds went into the PetroCaribe Development Fund, meant to finance social and infrastructure projects, from school renovations to housing. The deal freed up cash for the government, but critics say oversight was weak, leaving questions about mismanagement. Fiscally, it temporarily reduced pressure on Jamaica's budget, but the deferred payments still counted as long-term liabilities. In 2015, the government bought back much of its PetroCaribe debt at a discount, replacing low-interest loans with global bonds, a move that reduced debt in one sense, but increased exposure to global oil price volatility. When Venezuela Venezuela's economy faltered and PetroCaribe effectively collapsed in 2018, Jamaica turned to the international oil market, buying crude on the open market. Today, Jamaica remains highly sensitive to global oil shocks. Any spike in crude prices can ripple through electricity rates, transportation costs, and the cost of living, a vulnerability that PetroCaribe once partially shielded the country from. In response, the government has explored renewable energy options like wind, solar, and hydro, with a policy target to reach 50% renewables by 2030. Progress has been gradual. Right now, reliance on renewables stands at roughly 12%. Now, while small-scale projects exist and some solar farms supply the grid, renewables still account for a minority of total electricity generation, leaving oil as the backbone of Jamaica's energy system. Experts warn that without fast adoption of alternative energy, the country remains dependent on imported fossil fuels and exposed to market fluctuations. In short, PetroCaribe once gave Jamaica a lifeline of affordable oil and development funding. Today, the country imports crude from global markets, carries a legacy of debt, and still faces the challenge of moving towards a cleaner, more secure energy future. Reporting for Lead Story Prime, I'm Amoy Harriet.
Thanks, Amoy. That is our overview. That clearly, Keenan Faulkner, people are now interested in figuring out if we are so vulnerable to shocks. Where does it show up first here in Jamaica? Is it electricity bills? Is it transport, food prices? Or is it first shown in government finances?
Well, I mean, you think about electricity first. I mean, that is the largest subsector of consumption, you know, and then transport. You know, you think about all the vehicles on the road. Just looking at the import bill, a third of it is in just oil. You know, a $6 billion US import bill and around $2 billion US. And then you haven't thought about all of the other corollary parts of that are related to the oil sector. So you're talking about just importing vehicles and everything that depends, you know, on it. So I think that's where it would be felt. But then it would also be felt, you know, in just general prices. So inflation that is imported is usually felt most acutely in two places, and that's in food and fuel. So imported inflation along either of those lines, you know, when commodity prices spike, we're going to really feel it no matter what we can do. So we just can't avoid that reality, given that we're a small, open, highly import-dependent economy. And that's just one of the structural features that policymakers have to deal with. And while we have been sort of turning the tide a little bit in terms of renewables, it looks better today than it did 20 years ago. Again, at 12%, that's not, you know, where we ideally want to be, and we're 4 years away from 2030. Are we going to get to 50% from 12% in that short space of time?
A plan, but clearly a time-bound one, and one that we might not be able to achieve. I'll pull Professor Clayton in after the break on that as we continue to look at fuel here in Jamaica, oil, power, and Jamaica's energy reality. Stay with us here inside Lead Story.
Let's delve deep into the issues. We'll take you beneath the surface.
Greetings and salutations. My name is Orville Higgins, and it's another edition of Fan Central.
Talking to the people at the heart of the top sporting stories. Hear from your favorite sportsmen and women and the administrators who work tirelessly to make it all happen. It's live sports talk.
I've written an entire article.
Yeah.
Looking at all the major issues every Tuesday at 9 p.m. It's Fan Central.
Welcome back. We've been talking with economist Keenan Faulkner and former professor of sustainable development at the University of the West Indies Mona campus, Anthony Clayton. Professor Clayton, before the break, you spoke to us about the things that we would have to do to unlock ourselves from oil, indicating that we're at a place now where renewables could actually take over. Keenan Faulkner talked to us about the cars that we import, the things that we do that are locked into oil, something that you mentioned as well. So in 2026, is oil dependence primarily a policy failure or the unavoidable reality of being a small island developing state?
It's certainly not the unavoidable reality of being a small island developing state. It's if you look at what other small countries have done, in fact, a good example is Denmark, a country with a population of 5 million. They completely rebuilt their energy system and moved away from fossil fuels to dependence on and developed their renewable energy resources. Now that was a 30-year program. So what you need is to make this decision 30 years ago, and then to ensure bipartisan political support so that you don't have a change of direction every time there's a change in government. And Denmark did both of those. They made the decision to rebuild their energy system on the basis of renewables after the first oil price shock back in the 70s. And then they built a cross-party political consensus that this was the way to go so that they could pursue the policy consistently between administrations. And they now have one of the cheapest and most reliable energy systems in the whole of Europe. It's a tremendous achievement, but it shows what even a small country can do with policy consistency and making the relevant investments, but phasing them in over years and decades. The only problem is that we didn't make this decision, and it is partly as a result of the support that we got from PetroCaribe, which actually reduced the incentive to start diversifying away from oil. Now, I know that we used some of the PetroCaribe money to build things like the Wigton wind farm, but that is actually still a relatively small step. It's nothing like on the scale of what would be needed to actually rebuild our grid system and our distribution side. Because one of the things that you have to do is consider moving to a devolved energy system where you have many contributions from renewable sources around the country. You need a smart grid to distribute this, and you need energy storage. Now, the big obstacle for many years was the cost of energy storage, but that has plummeted in recent years. Battery costs alone have fallen by 95% since 2010, and many new energy storage technologies have been developed in that time. So the cost is not really an issue. The fact that we're a small island is not an issue. What is really the issue is that we need a sustained policy move in this direction. And if we can achieve that and a bipartisan political consensus on this, it will take years, it will take several decades, but in that time, we can take our dependency on oil close to zero.
Well, that would have been a plan to have had in place, as you said, 30 years ago, but 20 years ago in 2025, Jamaica signed on to the PetroCaribe agreement. So to understand where we are today and why Professor Clayton is disappointed that we clearly didn't make that switch, we have to revisit one of the most consequential energy arrangements in our modern history, PetroCaribe. Former Energy Minister Philip Paulwell spoke with us about what PetroCaribe was designed to do.
Okay, well, PetroCaribe was introduced in 2005. I was the deputy chairman of the grouping which comprised Caribbean countries headed by Venezuela and also Cuba. It was designed to solve a number of problems. Firstly, we wanted to get access to Venezuelan crude for the refinery at moderate prices. But more importantly, we wanted to get a financing in place that PetroCaribe brought, which enabled us to defer payment on the purchases of crude from Venezuela and to pay back over 20 years. And in fact, one of the outcomes of PetroCaribe having amassed a debt of about $3 billion US dollars, Venezuela was able to discount that debt by over 50%. So it was a massive benefit to the Jamaican economy.
You've just heard former Minister Paulwell describe PetroCaribe from the policymaker's seat. As Minister of Commerce, Science and Technology, Philip Paulwell had announced signing the initial agreements with Venezuela in 2005, not 2025. Keenan, having now heard not only from Professor Clayton, but also Philip Paulwell indicating the problem that PetroCaribe was designed to solve, what is your analysis now, 20 years on?
Well, there's no doubt that PetroCaribe was a mutually beneficial arrangement for Jamaica and Venezuela. At the time, Venezuela was in a bit of a cash flow problem. So the fact that they could get money from us for it, we could get the oil, you just look at that as tit for tat, and we were able to execute that arrangement. Now, on the point of it being morally hazardous, there's always an element of that, because when you know that something is there, you have a disincentive or no incentive at all to now diversify. So that is always something that's going to be present. But from a fiscal standpoint, just look at the fact that without that discount of PetroCaribe debt, by the time it ended in 2018, 2019, our debt was around 96%. Had it been, not discounted, that debt could have possibly been 120, closer to 120% of GDP. So on the fiscal side, it did open up space. That was always going to be one of the objectives of doing it. I mean, you get to pay 50% up front, and the other 50% you pay over 25 years at 1%. That is going to realign some of the debt dynamics, at least. On the balance of payment side, you don't now have to commit all of those resources at one time. So it gives you some amount of leverage in terms of your cash flow at the time. So both on the fiscal and the monetary side, it had a positive impact. And the numbers will show that, and I don't think there's really much debate about that.
Well, this is, though, something that Professor Clayton says we, as you've indicated as well, benefited from, but certainly locked us into a certain perspective. Professor Clayton, having heard now Philip Paulwell indicate the problem that PetroCaribe was set out to solve, was it perhaps too early for us, not in the way that Denmark was able to do it 30 years ago, but given our realities, was it perhaps the best route for us to have used at the time?
There is absolutely no doubt that we were able to effect a significant reduction in our level of debt to GDP. Now, that worked out very well for us. It didn't work out so well for the people of Venezuela. As you know, PetroCaribe was primarily a political program developed by President Hugo Chavez back in 2004, 2005. And that one aspect of the PetroCaribe fund is that he also bought our political support. And if you look at the votes in the Organization of American States, every PetroCaribe member, with the exception of Honduras, voted to bar the legitimate opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, from speaking to the Organization of American States at the request of President Chavez. So there was a certain political moral hazard in taking the money. Financial benefits to Jamaica were great. Financial benefits to the people of Venezuela were more arguable, especially as they only got paid back 50 cents on the dollar on the approximately, I think it was about half the total debt. And part of the rest of the debt is, of course, we can't pay back because financial transfers to PDVSA are currently embargoed by the United States. So financially, the people of Venezuela did not come out of this so well.
I think that is context for many people, Professor Clayton, because that helps them better understand not only some of the names that are currently in the news, but some of the dynamics that are currently in the news. So Maria Corina Machado had won the Nobel Peace Prize last year and had dedicated her Nobel Peace Prize to President Donald Trump. President Donald Trump now on the 3rd of January had now gone into Venezuela with U.S. troops and kidnapped the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, along with his wife, a conversation we had earlier today inside Global Lead. But what this means then is Jamaica had to be part of a dynamic that was partly beneficial to Jamaica, and as you said, one that was meant to be a cooperative one. Let's take a listen to what Philip Powell had to say, because we put that question to him. Did Jamaica have to think about some of the strategic problems in aligning ourselves so closely with Venezuela for this oil? That having had this conversation about votes there in the Organization of American States, and you talked about PDVSA, which is the oil company, the state-owned oil company in Venezuela, that it's clear that we're going to have to look at in 2026 who benefited and who did not. Its collapse in 2015 as a preferential agreement was also something that many Jamaicans saw. Before we go to that clip there with Philip Powell, let me pull you in for a second here, Keenan Faulkner, because for many people, they think of the benefit to Jamaica without thinking of the consequences. Is it easy to divorce some of the economic benefits to Jamaica with some of the real world consequences that come off from getting cheaper oil?
I mean, it definitely isn't. And I think obviously that would now account for the fact that towards the end of the agreement, after the end of the agreement, Jamaica had sought to reacquire the shares in PDVSA. So because of course, the sanctions on Venezuela imposed by the U.S., it was a way of sort of, trying to de-link and detach.
And Jamaica in 2015 benefited from that by not having to then transfer, since global transfer markets did not allow for us to send money back to Venezuela, something that Professor Clayton says was to our benefits. Should we be waiting for a time where they ask us to now pay up?
I mean, there's always going to be those sorts of geopolitical concerns and who you align yourselves with and whatever the consequences might be. But it boils back down to what is the trade-off? Can you now say, look, we're not going to do this because somebody else hates our friend or our neighbor, or are we going to, stand on a matter of principle? It all depends on what happens in the global space.
And if standing on that matter of principle means that your people pay higher prices, that might be a principle that doesn't win you elections. And certainly it didn't work out very well for the People's National Party here, but other political organizations across the region benefited from that cheap oil agreement, something that might not only be characterized as cheap oil, but certainly was a benefit coming out of PetroCaribe. Professor Anthony Clayton has unfortunately to leave us at this time, but thank you so very much for being with us inside Lead Story this evening.
You're most welcome, Julian. Can I just leave you with one final thought?
Yes.
These decisions like this are really important strategic decisions, and they've always got multiple dimensions. In this case, obviously, everybody was focused on the financial, but you also there is an inescapable political dimension. You have to think about who you're aligning yourself with, and in particular, the risks of aligning ourselves with a very oppressive ruling regime.
And that's certainly,
Venezuela.
I think that's certainly something that we have to have more conversation about, because when we have this sort of cheap oil for Jamaica conversation, the lives of people in other countries are at risk as well. Former Professor of Sustainable Development at the University of the West Indies Mona campus, Anthony Clayton, a pleasure having you on with us. We'll take a break inside Lead Story and come back with more here on CVM Television.
the internationally acclaimed On Stage with Winford Williams.
At a new time, Saturdays at 8 p.m. on CVM TV.
So much more than entertainment.
Start your journey with a Jane Bank Small Business Loan with small business loans with as little as $10,000 and up to $4 million.
The time is 8:30.
Every dream conquered is another dream gained. I land and I fly again like a jet plane. Headed straight in your direction. 'Cause I'm wiser, one step closer. I'm winning 'cause I work so hard. And the music hits I play, and the people them I say we are my show tonight. Oh, what a feeling! Don't stop dreaming. Keep on believing in the power of the feeling. Whatever you want, take a chance. Song in your heart, step in your dance. You got a spark, don't put it down. Shine your lights on.
Oil, energy, and Jamaica's reality. That's what we're discussing today. Welcome back. We're still with economist Keenan Faulkner, and now joining us on Zoom is David Barrett, one of the deputy chairs of the private sector organization of Jamaica's Energy Committee. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Barrett.
Good night. Happy New Year.
We're pulling you in first. As you're coming in hot, because from the private sector's perspective, how exposed are Jamaican businesses to global oil price volatility, especially at this point in time?
So Jamaica still imports quite a bit of oil from the international market at the global prices, the competitive market prices. And those are usually not in our favor, which is why, of course, there's a move towards renewable energy. And that affects our electricity bill in particular. And of course, whether you're a private sector company or you're a residential citizen, that cost is a pass-through cost on your electricity bill. So there's no other way to put it, but the international price of oil affects every Jamaican and every business directly and significantly, of course. Within the region, we are among the highest prices for electricity costs. Not the highest, but the region itself does have very high electricity costs, and Jamaica is one of those.
Keenan Faulkner, what are some of the macroeconomic spillovers now with that sort of reality that our companies or our businesses and even our households have to deal with?
Well, I mean, thinking about just the cost of electricity, the cost of transport, those are two very large sectors. In fact, when you have just a price increase, for example, in the transport sector, that's significant enough to affect inflation generally. So when there is global oil price volatility, it sort of embeds an uncertainty that you can't plan for, or it makes it more difficult to now plan for. So you can't lock in prices for the future. You can't think about how many resources will I have to commit. And just going back to the example of the 70s, if prices rose overnight and I still have to maintain those commitments, what's that going to look like now from my personal household account or just the country's fiscal account? Because the price of oil, as was said, it affects the price of just about everything else. And uncertainty on that front is never a good thing, generally, in economic terms.
We spoke with former Energy Minister Philip Paulwell on this, asking him if PetroCaribe was fundamentally about oil or giving us fiscal space, creating fiscal space for the government so that we didn't have and see some of these macroeconomic spillovers. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
It did create significant fiscal space for government. So it was twofold: energy security, which we were able to achieve, and of course this fiscal space, which allowed the government of the day to utilize resources to fund many projects, housing, etc.
David Barrett, having heard now former Energy Minister Philip Powell talk about a beneficial arrangement that Jamaica previously had, the PetroCaribe agreement with Venezuela. Is there any space you see right now for us figuring out something like that? Because you have raised the concerns about electricity costs here in Jamaica, especially for private companies.
Well, I would say that our primary opportunity now is to build out our own indigenous resources. That would be solar, wind, hydro in particular. And by doing that, we are reducing the amount of fossil fuel that we import. In other words, the amount of energy that we import and for which we have absolutely no control over the price. One of the things about the PetroCaribe arrangement was that for small islands like Jamaica and the other islands in the region, is that it's hard to negotiate the prices you want because of the smaller volumes that you take. And PetroCaribe would have allowed for large volumes from one source to the region. But we don't have that opportunity as it is now. And so building out our energy resources, the Jamaican policy target is 50% by 2030. And based on the various findings and the build out of independent power producers, the JPS, and the government driving the targets, we are getting there. But then we will also have to look at getting beyond the 50% as a raised ambition in order to control our electricity prices.
Getting there, but not quite there. Not quite sure we'll be hitting that target in 2030 as well, given that we're in 2026. Now, we also put that question to former Minister of Energy, Philip Powell, asking him about this U.S. engagement with Venezuela and if it could lead to us going back to something like PetroCaribe. He wasn't as confident either. Let's take a listen.
It depends. I think whilst the sanctions remain, I don't think there's a possibility. But if the sanctions are lifted, I believe that there are opportunities. For example, we still have a refinery that needs sour crude. We still have a refinery that needs to be upgraded and expanded. So perhaps that project could be brought back. But also, Jamaica imports significant amounts of liquefied natural gas. And Venezuela is one of the largest producers of, well, not producers, they have the largest reserve of natural gas. And if that is made available to Jamaica, you could see significant price reduction in relation to LNG and the price of electricity.
So that was former Energy Minister Philip Powell. We did invite current Energy Minister Darrell Vaz inside Lead Story this evening. Unfortunately, he was unable to join us. However, the current energy prices are the things that we are discussing now, even as we look to the past and to see some of the good times that we had. Keenan Faulkner, how much of Jamaica's cost of living problem, especially as we look at energy now, is an energy problem in disguise? That is, the cost of the things that we complain about here and the increase in the cost of the things that we're looking at is really an energy discussion.
I mean, it's a lot. And, you know, we can speak about LNG. While prices would be cheaper, it really should be seen as more of a transition mechanism that will eventually get us to greater renewables. So LNG, while good, you know, we really have to now strive for greater usage of solar, wind, hydro, and things like that. But energy is so fundamental to our everyday lives, you know, and at one of the highest costs of energy in the world. If you were to even slash it in, say, half, or, you know, you bring it down to 5 cents per kilowatt hour kind of thing, that range, it makes manufacturing more competitive. You know, you can export more, you can attract more investment, because that is one of the main structural disincentives to investment in Jamaica. It affects the cost of just about everything else. It affects the cost of transport. That feeds into now retail and wholesale prices. Of course, we all experience it in our electricity bills. And you can now just rearrange your household budget to stop spending as much on electricity bills, for example, and putting that into other productive uses or in savings. So at the very micro level, you're thinking about now energy is just the main hindrance, I think, to actually getting the sort of growth economically that we want. When people look at close to 40 cents per kilowatt hour, there is no incentive to produce, at those extremely uncompetitive rates.
Well, that is going to certainly be concerning for business interests as well. David Barrett, the U.S. is doubling down on oil. They're saying that global climate consensus has weakened, and they're doing a lot of the weakening that we can see. What signal does that send to Jamaican investors and businesses planning long term, especially as they're looking now at the cost of energy here in Jamaica and it continuing to be out of our hands versus more renewable sources that might be greater under, or rather more under our control?
Well, I have a slightly different perspective because the Caribbean and most of the countries which are still a part of the Paris Agreement have raised their ambition. As you may be aware, the recent Conference of the Parties, COP, which happened last year, a number of countries raised their ambition. In fact, Jamaica, among other Caribbean countries, 3 others that I'm aware of, actually raised their ambition for climate change impact mitigation, right? So we are pushing full ahead. We're very clear on our risks. And as mentioned by the other party on this conversation, energy is such a diffuse dimension that we cannot afford to avoid it. The improvements. There's something that was mentioned, and I just put it in this context. For us as a small island, it's about energy diversification. So natural gas is a part of that diversification away from oil only. But also the electricity that we're generating from renewables, and which we intend to increase, then gives us a new opportunity to move away from fossil fuels for transportation to electricity for transportation. Now, as you know, there's an EV policy, which is 12% by 2030, and Jamaica is moving towards that goal. So all of those things are feeding into what private sector has agreed to. There are a number of private sector entities which are moving towards electric mobility. They are putting in solar for their systems to reduce their costs and produce reliability. They're also doing energy efficiency interventions, which reduce the amount of energy they're using. So we have to, as a small island, use the full pool of all the tools that we have available in our energy toolbox. And that's what we're doing.
Well, I hope that we're doing it, because next I'm going to be grilling you too on renewables and this transition now away from fossil fuels, especially as we watch the global unrest going on as the United States has now intervened in Venezuela, and global oil prices are now set to be moving as a result of what we're watching. Greenland is up next. You're watching Nigeria be in the news. All major oil producing countries now in the headlines. We'll talk about what that means for us and if renewables might be our answer here inside Lead Story Prime.
Delve deep into the issues. We'll take you beneath the surface.
Greetings and salutations. My name is Orville Higgins, and it's another edition of Fan Central.
Talking to the people at the heart of the top sporting stories. Hear from your favorite sportsmen and women and the administrators who work tirelessly to make it all happen. It's live sports talk.
I've written an entire article.
Yeah.
Looking at all the major issues every Tuesday at 9 p.m. It's Fan Central.
the internationally acclaimed On Stage with Winfred Williams.
At a new time, Saturdays at 8 p.m. on CVM TV.
So much more than entertainment.
Yeah, man, this is Grams Morgan. I want you to keep watching CVM TV, be inspired, be informed, right? See it happen right here on CVM TV. Morgan Heritage till year 3000 and beyond. Grams Morgan say that. See it? Blessings.
We've been talking to economist Keenan Faulkner and joined by David Barrett, Deputy Chair of the Private Sector Organization of Jamaica's Energy Committee. David Barrett, I have to pull you in first because as we start off this conversation about renewables, you indicating that we have an electric vehicle policy here in Jamaica, working our way to becoming this safer, better place for renewable energy, even at the same time watching the United States pull out of 66 global agreements. One of those, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that did lead to that conference of the parties that you spoke of that took place last year. Businesses are hearing a lot about renewables. You are hearing a lot about renewables. From where you sit, are renewables currently saving Jamaican companies money? Or are they offering long-term promise? Are we discussing this and will we be discussing the same thing in 2030?
It definitely is offering savings. Companies are experiencing that savings, and that's part of the reason why renewables, particularly solar, which is an easier option for a company to install, has become the go-to option. In fact, we have over 200 megawatts, as it were, of independent power production from the different renewables. There is almost 21 megawatts that is just really for a lot of large entities. So we're talking hotels, manufacturers, guest houses, other production locations or business locations. So solar is very, very easy. It is cutting their costs 20-30% in some cases. And a lot depends on how you combine your energy. In addition, there is the opportunity to add batteries. So batteries then give you the opportunity not only to generate electricity during the daytime when the sun is up, but you can store some of it, which you can then use in the night. So they are now able to actually increase the bandwidth of the energy use for the business sector. It's a huge win-win. And of course, we have the net billing policy, which allows some amount of sale of that electricity. So there is an additional revenue stream to some extent. There's a limitation on that, right? But it is noted that that's there. But we also have other regulated interventions which we await. So for example, power wheeling is one which would give, for example, a lot of large entities which have large land spaces in different places to generate power and send over the line to their location. And then there are a lot of different models for how entities can provide, let me say, contractors can provide that power with lower costs, lower initial costs to the private sector. So it's a win-win, and they have recognized this, businesses, and they're going for it.
I think that's such an optimistic view, but one that many people would not, without having heard from you, David Barrett, have understood that businesses are seeing the opportunities that renewables can provide and then actually taking the time to now implement that in their businesses. We spoke with Energy.
I want to make a shameless plug to say the private sector organization of Jamaica actually does have solar PV.
Oh, there you go.
Car park.
So talking the talk and walking the walk then over there at the PSOJ.
At the same time.
There you go. And that's really helpful for us to know. We also put this question to former Energy Minister Philip Paulwell. Should Jamaica be hedging its bets with solar and renewables or keep going the path that we are right now? Let's listen to his response.
No, my own view is that we need to move away from fossil fuel unless we find fossil fuels. In Jamaica, that search is still on. I think more and more we're seeing the benefits of renewables, far cheaper, technology has improved, and very importantly, storage is now a factor that will enable generators to produce electricity beyond the window of the sunshine. You can now store the electricity and have it 24/7. So I believe that that is the future for Jamaica.
That's that battery conversation there that David Barrett put on the table. Keenan Faulkner, though, former Energy Minister Philip Powell said, unless and if we find the oil here. That's a search that Jamaica is currently having underway. We have had neighbors in Guyana find one of the biggest oil deposits, and next door, Venezuela, the largest proven oil deposits on the planet. That's therefore something that Jamaicans feel they could be excited about. But the Guyana discussion has raised a concern. What happens if you find oil at a time where the world is moving away from oil? What is Jamaica's in your crystal ball? What's our plan then if we do in fact discover oil?
So realistically, anybody who finds oil, I think, will exploit it to the best possible extent that it can. So as much as we want to consider environmental considerations in terms of moving away from fossil fuels, not just the fiscal cost of it, but the environmental benefit of doing so, I think it is possible to have both, but you sort of just reduce the dependence. So it doesn't mean that you're now going to go all the way to zero in terms of fossil fuels. You'll still have it, but you're now having LNG, you're having renewables, but you hope that most of it at least is renewables. Now, on the point of what do we do to facilitate?
Because I wanted to ask that to you, which is, all right, from an economic standpoint, can Jamaica realistically scale renewables without, as you heard there, the consistent international financing, especially in the context where if we find oil, we want to use it. If oil is cheap, it makes more sense to use it. But at the same time, hearing David Barrett and hearing others in the space, they're saying a balance is what they're hoping will be struck. How do we get that to that place of balance?
I think it's going to be difficult without the support of international financing. And just the idea of climate financing is something that sends a signal. So, Jamaica has picked up on the signals. We all know what the benefits of renewables will be. We want to move in that direction of greener energy, just greening everything. So you green everything from just fiscal operations, procurement, everything has to have a climate consideration. So therefore, without financing, that's going to be very difficult. Right now, the government, what it does and what it can do realistically through fiscal policy is just giving grants, subsidies, lessening taxes. On the monetary side, you keep interest rates low so you can get people to sort of access loans to be able to have the startup infrastructure, which is, of course, much easier to do now than it was in the past because the calculus has shifted where now, obviously, we have been discussing that it's even in some respects cheaper than fossil fuels. So it depends on people's preferences, but to get it wide scale, for the time being, I think it's now just very segregated, it's very fragmented, isolated pockets. But now getting that scale requires a vast amount of resources that I don't think internationally is being committed because we have the discussions. We watch COP every single year. COP, I think, one time had been chaired by somebody who is the head of an oil conglomerate.
Yes.
So that is those contestations, that international political economy, whose interests are going to predominate. We have to just sit and watch. We can't influence that or control that to any meaningful extent. But no, how do we best derive from it? Just position ourselves by sending and maintaining those signals that I spoke about earlier.
All right, that is going to clearly then be something that we look at for ages. How are we going to consider this transition? What are we going to be doing about oil and resources? David Barrett, let me just have you pull everything together then for us. From your perspective, 5 years from now, how should Jamaica measure success in energy policy? What are we looking at? Lower electricity bills, greater energy security, or business competitiveness? What should we be looking at and say, Jamaica, you did a good job?
5 years from now, we should have exceeded the 50% of our energy from renewables exceeded. 5 years from now, we should have a fleet of electric vehicles which use less, which transportation. 5 years from now, our electricity bill should be comparable with any of the any of the first world nations which have maximized their energy options so that we are competitive in business, manufacturing, sales, operations. 5 years from now, we should have a better mix of energy, which will still include some of the fossil fuels, but to a lower extent. And of course, the mix of renewables, natural gas should bring us closer to our nationally determined contribution goals, which are significantly more ambitious this time around.
All right, I like an ambitious Jamaica. Keenan Faulkner, given everything that we've seen with global energy systems, what's going on, the conflicts that have broken out, what's the single most urgent energy decision you think Jamaica needs to make?
I think we now need to decide what are we going to do in a practical sense to get to our goals. So, but obviously the biggest thing now is just renegotiating energy contracts with our main energy supplier. And then what is going to happen after that? Because the cost of energy, as we have already identified, is the main imperative, at least economically. It will have other benefits for the population. But just now, apart from it being aspirational, we have made progress that is slower than we want to have made, at least. And now, how do we, in real terms, get to where we want to go? Because what is the likelihood of hitting 50% in less than 4 years' time?
There you go. The likelihood of that is being questioned. But that's it for tonight's edition of Lead Story Prime. What tonight makes clear is that Jamaica does not control oil, but we are responsible for how exposed we allow ourselves to remain. David Barrett and Keenan Faulkner, thank you so very much for joining us inside Lead Story Prime. That's it for today's edition of the show. I'm Jody Ann Quarry, and on behalf of the entire CVM production team, thank you for watching Lead Story Prime. Have a fantastic night, and I hope you stay safe.
Internationally acclaimed On Stage with Winfred Williams.
At a new time, Saturdays at 8 p.m. on CVM TV.
So much more than entertainment.
Every dream conquered is another dream gained. I land and I fly again like a jet plane. Headed straight in your direction, 'cause I'm wiser, one step closer. I'm winning 'cause I work so hard. And the music keeps on playing, and the people them I say we are my show tonight. Oh, what a feeling! Don't stop dreaming. Keep on believing in the power of the feeling. Whatever you want, take a chance. Song in your heart, step in your dance. You got a spark, don't put it down. Shine your lights on.
Let's delve deep into the issues. We'll take you beneath the surface.
Greetings and salutations. My name is Orville Higgins, and it's another edition of Fan Central.
Talking to the people at the heart of the top sporting stories. Hear from your favorite sportsmen and women and the administrators who work tirelessly to make it all happen. It's live sports talk.
I've written an entire article.
Yes.
Looking at all the major